And greetings, everyone. Welcome to the February webinar of our DEI Leaders Network. A few administrative notes before we get started. Because we have a large number of people on this webinar, we have muted the participants' audio lines. So we welcome questions and comments anytime during the presentation if you put that in your chat, and we'll have some time at the end of the panelists' discussions to ask questions. Holly and Elizabeth will be moderating the chat, and I'll be getting the questions. Just to start, I wanted to let you know a little bit about Diversity Works. And we created this DEI Leaders Network because we found out that the role of a DEI professional can be very lonely in a lot of organizations. Unless you're lucky enough to have a team of leaders working shoulder to shoulder, it's a big amount of responsibility on a tough topic. This network is intended to give DEI leaders a community to lean on and learn from. Before we get started, before we introduce our panelists, I wanted to introduce you to the work that we do. We are a women-owned company that evaluates the organization's DEI performance using an accurate data approach. We believe that effective DEI strategies are grounded in business drivers. And then when your DEI strategy is aligned with your business strategy, you'll make gains on both. Our approach seeks to understand the organization so we can build in a DEI strategic level and help ensure that it's embedded in the organization for long-term success. We don't want to give you a cookie cutter approach. We really base it uniquely on the organization, similar to what we are doing right now. We want to make sure that whatever we do is focused and comprehensive. Today's topic is the Black experience, which fits into the community, philanthropy, and sustainability box of our evaluation. However, it's not isolated in that box. Employee engagement, governance, recruiting, philanthropy, evaluation, and monitoring will help you reinforce your vision, values, and organization. It shows you that you walk the walk and talk the talk. It's important to understand the experiences of everyone. We look at the dimensions that we use in our DDS model to help organization understand where they're at, what they're doing, and where they want to go. Today's topic will help illustrate the interconnectedness of the different domains we evaluate in terms of DEI performance, and shows how making progress in one area can help support another area. Next slide, please, the panelist slide. Our first panelist is Jacqui Abrams, the author of Hush Money, which was featured in Forbes magazine as one of the bestsellers. This is how one woman proves systemic racism in the workplace. The book is inspired by true events and co-authored by two of her daughters. The focus of her book is to provide strategies that employers can use to prevent racism and to discuss how building allies internally and to identify covert signs of bias and racism in the workplace. Our second panelist is Kimble, the founder and CEO of Financial Service Innovation Coalition. He is the expert in economic diversity. His work includes the formation of health technology and economic empowerment and inclusion initiatives. Mr. Kimble routinely advises elected officials at the federal, state, and local levels. He's also an advisor for national and community groups on policies that perpetuate systemic racism that have not evolved over the years. We're going to start with Jacqui. So as we talked to Jacqui, I had a chance to discuss with Jacqui, and Jackie's going to give us a brief analysis of what she went through. And one of the things that we really wanted Jacqui to ask you, Jacqui, tell us about your experience when it comes to intersectionality, when it comes at the workplace, and how you define that, and how what you're doing right now to help organizations see some of the blind spots that they may have.
Well, thank you for that marvelous introduction. As you mentioned, I am the author of Hush Money: How One Woman Proved Systemic Racism in Her Workplace and Kept Her Job. My book is inspired by true events, and it actually gives you a chronicle of the 5-year journey of a woman named Ebony as she navigates racism in her workplace, working in a for-profit college. And so as we talk about my book, I want to tell you what actually brought me to writing my book. So I also had a career in higher education. My career spanned nearly 2 decades, so almost 20 years. And during that time frame, I worked in the finance department in this for-profit college, and I was exceptional at my job. I was very, very good at it. And it was a job that I actually loved and that I actually enjoyed. And it was a job that by any measure really should have been a successful career, but it wasn't. And the reason that it wasn't is because as I was building my career and climbing the corporate ladder, I kept finding myself becoming the repeated victim of racism in the workplace. And not the kind of racism that you typically see reflected in a lot of the books, the movies, and the TV shows about the type of racism that occurred decades ago when it was more overt, it was easily spotted. You could point at it, you could say, yes, this is racism. And unfortunately, that's not what I dealt with in my career. And that's unfortunately not what a lot of us are dealing with right now. The type of racism that I dealt with in my career was not the overt, easily spotted kind. It was the covert. It was hidden. It was much, much harder to prove. And so as I was building my career and working in these environments that were horrific, to say the least, I continued to suffer trauma. And that's a lot of things that you really don't hear too much about, that the racial trauma, the impact on the employee that is experiencing racism, because when they leave work at the end of the day after suffering racism, that trauma that they experience doesn't clock out when they do. They carry it with them and it becomes a part of them. So that's what I would like to talk to you and your guest about today is, just what that covert racism, that more hidden aspect of racism that is so much harder to prove, really looks like, because it's one of the primary reasons, Denise, that current DEI initiatives, as well as intentioned as they are, it's one of the primary reasons that they're just not as effective as they need to be and can be. And it's because a lot of them tend to focus on the more overt, easily spotted racism. And again, that's just not what we're dealing with in the workplace.
Thank you for that, Jacqui. And as far as you said to me that you had diversity training, and tell us more about the type of training that you had that you found that were ineffective.
So in my career, so I mentioned that I was in higher education and I had a 6-figure lucrative career. My career, like I said, spanned nearly 20 years. And during that 20 years, I worked in several different organizations. Each time that my career was derailed, and I would leave one company to go to the next company, hoping that my experience and my skills would speak for themselves and that my experiences there would be different. What I found throughout that nearly 20-year period is that there was no such place that existed for me. And the more disheartening part about it, Denise, was that in every single organization where I worked, they had anti-discrimination policies in place. They had diversity training every year. They even had diversity committees. And so it was very challenging and just heartbreaking for me, because in several of those organizations that I worked, the very people who were serving on the diversity committees were the same ones that were either targeting me or standing by and watching as I'm being targeted and doing nothing, if that makes sense.
Yes, I understand that. And so why do you think that, how would it have been different for you? What do you think should have happened versus what you experienced?
So that is a very good question. And, I've actually given that question a lot of thought over the years. I think a lot of organizations make the mistake of taking this huge initiative, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and putting it in HR because to them it makes so much sense to just kind of slap it into HR and to give HR this huge role to take. But HR may not be the best place for that initiative to be undertaken. And let me tell you why I say that. One of the things that I always tell anyone who brings me on their show, you're going to get straight talk from me, no chaser. You're going to get no sugar added. And so if you look at what happened to me, I've shared this with you before. I liken what happened to me, honestly, to what happened to George Floyd. And let me just tell you why I say that. If you remember what happened to George Floyd was killed in his community by a racist police officer, Derek Chauvin. Okay. Derek Chauvin was the person who actually took his last breath. But the thing is, he was not there alone. There were 3 other police officers there on that scene, okay? There was one police officer who was standing between Derek as Derek continued to take the life from George and the allies who were standing over here. People who were watching, they were seeing, they were observing what was happening, but they were afraid. They were powerless because of the authority figure standing in between them and what's happening to George over here. But there were 2 other police officers. There was one who had his hands holding down George's legs. Okay, so he's got his body on his legs. There's another one who's got his knee in his back. And then you've got Derek Chauvin, who's got his knee on his neck. So he's got the body weight of all 3 of them on him, rendering him completely powerless and helpless. So why do I bring that up today? The reason I bring this up is because of the 4 police officers who were on that scene. Derek Chauvin was the senior officer. He was the one in the position of power and influence. And so when he led, the others followed. And he ultimately killed George in his community. Now, if you take that scenario and you move it over to the workplace, this is what happened to me. I am a Black person. I am good at my job. I am exceptional at my job. I am climbing that corporate ladder. But then someone in that organization, and I'm not just talking, the person in the office next door who doesn't like me for whatever reason. I'm not talking about the person in the other department that doesn't like me for whatever reason. I'm talking about the person in that organization who, like Derek Chauvin, is a senior in that organization. They are a person of power and influence, and they target me. Well, they are the one that starts carrying out the act of killing my career, just like they killed George in his community, but they always have help because of their power and their influence. They inspire others in the organization to conspire with them. And then before you know it, you, the Black person who was now finding yourself working in the most horrific environment, is faced with 3 impossible choices. Most people will just suffer in silence, they need to keep their jobs. They have families to support. They hope if they don't make waves that it'll go away, and it never does.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Jacqui. We really appreciate your input, and hopefully we'll have some questions for you later on. We're going to let Kevin, who is more the advocacy piece of this program. And Kevin works with organizations and companies in the area of really trying them to see what the internal structural barriers are to different type of isms that are out there. So I'm going to let Kevin go on, and Kevin has his presentation up. We want to put that in. Then we'll open it up for question and answers. And thank you, Jacqui. Very emotional piece, and I appreciate you sharing with us. And everyone, please put your questions in the chat, and we will at one time take them. And later on, we'll open up the floor to make sure that if you want to ask the question directly to Jacqui or Kevin, go ahead. Next slide, please. Kevin?
Yep. The other slide there.
All right. All right.
So
go ahead, Kevin.
The first thing I want to say is that, I sympathize with Jacqui and empathize with Jacqui, and thanks for putting me on the panel with her. That was a great story. The sad thing is that I hear that all the time. I always say that I'm no longer any fun to have at a dinner party, because I sit at this focal point where I get calls from all over the country about people who are being treated in the most horrific ways, being left out, being discriminated against. And it is actually, it's disheartening, but it's also, eye-opening, because you think we have a task force that we pull together, and where we tell people wherever, if I'm in Minnesota or I'm in Texas or I'm in Georgia, I'm in California, everyone's suffering the same fate. I mean, everyone thinks there's this little person of them. There's not a Black person around that's not suffering this level of exclusion and or harassment and or discrimination. Which is really sad, but I've yet to meet anyone who's not facing this same problem.
Thank you. You want to tell us a little bit more about the type of advocacy that you do and where?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. So we'll start with the title of our presentation is Forces of Intolerance Continue to Fight Against Minority Inclusion. And what we do, we're a think tank, right? And I didn't come to this, to this part of my life, I didn't start out here. I started out as a financial services lobbyist and or tactician. I created what is now known as the non-bank chartered OCC. So I'm a financial services person. But in the process of working on financial services and trying to create better credit options, we were traveling around the country, and we started to realize that the biggest problem for minorities or other underserved people is not lack of credit, but lack of income and lack of inclusion in the economy. So next slide. So we write white papers. We have task forces. We meet with people. Again, we travel around the country. We are basically our own. We've got so much data and input. We were supposed to write a book. We haven't written it yet, but all of the experiences we've had trying to go around and work with different communities. So for instance, we talk about labor unions. In California, all the labor unions are under a consent decree because of racial discrimination, because labor unions discriminate against Black people as much as anyone else, leaving them out of the workforce. So I won't bore you with this. You can go to the next slide. Okay, you can go to the next slide. That's about who we are. I don't know here, but this is the thing this is what I really want to talk about today. When I talk about the forces of inclusion, when you talk about DEI, everyone thinks like, that just internally people just don't understand they're being racist. I call that BS. They know exactly what they're doing. I mean, these companies are, there are people within the companies from the leadership on down who know exactly what they're doing. And I'll take Sherwin-Williams, Cleveland, in Cleveland, the city of Cleveland, which is 54% Black. Sherwin-Williams is building a $1 billion business, $1 billion facility. There are at least 4 or 5 major Black contractors in Cleveland. Sherwin-Williams has yet to contract with a single one of them for a prime contract, right? Even though 300 billion of the money 300 million of the money is government funded. So there's no DEI program or DEI, policy that's going to make Sherwin-Williams is being purposely discriminatory, right? They're leaving Black people out. There's no, and they've been, I work with SC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference is one of the organizations we work with. They've protested, they've called, they've asked for meetings. Sharon Williams is like, go do something to yourself. So I always say D&I is basically not a dependency. It's a sellout for companies. They're basically able to hide behind this document they say they do, and when they don't live up to it, they say, well, we're trying to live up to it. I say that's not true. They know that they're being discriminatory. The AASHTO, here's a report from AASHTO. AASHTO is the Association for State Highway Transportation Officials. They released a report dealing with infrastructure, saying that over the last 40 years, they know they've been discriminatory, that they have not hired minority firms to do this kind of work. Right? And then this another mission of ours this year is this the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, has a mission-driven bank fund, so $120 billion fund that they've created in theory to help Black and minority banks serve their communities better. They put out an RFP to bring in a money manager, but they've written the proposal in such a way that no minority fund managers could qualify. So you're going to have a $120 billion fund aimed at minority banks with a non-minority manager of the fund, right? Again, this is not by accident. This is not they don't understand. This is they're explicitly writing the rules so that they don't have to incorporate us. And then you get to this, the other part that's so insidious about this, why I call them the forces of intolerance. Every time the government tries to help Black people, a group of white people sue, right? So Black farmers have been discriminated against for 50 years. The U.S. Department of Ag is one of the most racist institutions in the government, and they've been discriminating against Black farmers for 50 years. As soon as there was a program set up to help them, white farmers sued, saying it was reverse discrimination against white farmers. Right? Secondly, the SEC set up a board representation model to make sure more minorities got on board, corporate boards. A bunch of white people sued, said that was reverse discrimination. And then the SBA, which everyone probably remembers from 2 summers ago, was heavily criticized for not making PPP loans available to minority businesses. Well, to remedy that, SBA set up a special window for minority business to apply. A bunch of white people sued, said that was reverse discrimination. Now, that's racist on its face. Right? Basically, they're saying that if a Black person gets something, it's discriminatory against white people, even though white people get stuff all the time. Like this becomes so absurd that you can't apply any kind of goodwill towards the people who are doing this. That they're absolutely being discriminatory. And I will say something a little aggressive here. There's a story on PBS, a documentary earlier this week, about a guy named Warless Jackson Sr., who was the NAACP treasurer in Natchez, Mississippi in 1965. He got a job as a supervisor. He was going to be the only supervisor in the whole county of Natchez. They blew him up with a car bomb, right? So basically, 50 years later, we haven't made any more progress. Anytime a Black person tries to move ahead, the white infrastructure piles on them. Go to the next slide. These are some, so we wrote a letter, we've written some letters on this thing. You can, if anyone wants to see some of the work we've done, they can do it. We can move forward. Kevin's
group does letters and the advocates. So I really wanted you to talk about the advocacy. We have organizations that are around that they want to know what to do. And thank you for that.
Okay. So advocacy was, and one of our big goals for the last 3 years has been advocacy. We did a thing on Capitol Hill during Black Caucus. Last time they actually had an in-person Black Caucus. And the whole conversation was, Black money matters, and advocacy was the subtitle, meaning minorities don't spend enough time advocating in all these places we're talking about. So the FDIC, there's, the AASHTO, the transportation, we need to organize. So what we do is we pull people together, we do panels, we write members of Congress, we talk to members of Congress, we talk to city councils, state legislatures. We dig in as much as we can into all of the different policy areas and try to get, because advocacy is a function of numbers and numbers is a function of strength, right? Or strength is a function of numbers. So our goal is to make sure we get more people in to this process. And we work on it. I mean, I can, if you want to join one of our task forces, we have a task force dealing with healthcare, health inequities. We have one dealing with financial services inequity. We have one dealing with infrastructure and contracting. There's all this conversation about the supply chain being disrupted, and they need truck drivers, but Black truck drivers are basically underserved. They're underutilized. I get calls from Black truck drivers around the country all the time saying, no one wants to give us major contracts, so we're scrounging from work. So we have a task force on that. We work with corporations. We've been very lucky to find some corporations who are committed to this, and you can tell the ones who are committed because they actually get beyond a D&I policy and actually work on projects. And we're always interested in working on projects with people and doing that kind of work. Next slide. So yes, if you are, to get beyond, just saying that you want to do something, doing something. One thing, most corporations, we have 10.5 million unfilled jobs in America, which seems like a lot, but we had 7.5 million in 2017. So the increase is not as big as people make it out to be in the media, but we have 10.5 million unfilled jobs. Black workforce participation is like less than 50% by most estimates. Yet corporations spend very little time recruiting and or training young African Americans. So for instance, there's a shortage of pilots, but no airlines spend money to get people through flight school. There's a shortage of utility linemen, yet no utility companies spend money to get people trained to be utility linemen. So one of the things we try to do is we've created a workforce program within one of our nonprofits, and we have a workforce program. We also have a small business development where we help people raise money through crowdfunding. So anytime if people in your community, I say it's very important that you actually dive in and try to help people. Even if it's 2 people a year, you help. That's more important than having a D&I policy statement, because then you're actually moving forward. And I'd say too, internally, people know the racists in their, who are racist in their organizations. We worked with a utility lineman company and got several African-American kids jobs because they didn't have any. They came to us because they wanted some minority utility lineman workers. They came to us. After the first 8 got hired, the white supervisor started complaining there were too many Black people working at the company. So they had to have a special meeting to tell the people that they had 1,000 unfilled jobs and cut the crap. So people know they have a problem internally. They just have to deal with it. Next slide.
I think that's
it.
That's it. But one of the things, thank you for putting that hiring diversity work, our approach, we seek to understand the business perspective. We don't go in there and cookie cut and tell people exactly what to do. We have an opportunity to really look at their strategy, or if they do have one or don't have one. And we probably have individuals in this, in the chat room that might want to speak about that. We don't check the boxes. We try to understand the organization so we can build a strategic level to make it sustainable and long-term, because I've been doing diversity, and I have some people in the panel, in the chat, that have been doing diversity for a long time. And what we believe needs to happen is that gets embedded and stays. It's not a one-time event. Diversity training is not going to solve all the problems. It goes on with leadership, has to take partnership and participate in that process. It's not it's not a one-time event. You can't think you're taking a diversity class and that's going to solve all your problems. It's driven by leadership, holding leaders accountable, looking at your internal process, which is what we do. We look at your external process also. So we have a complete, and I think Elizabeth will talk a little bit more about that as we close out. But we do have some questions, and I'm going to go over and ask some of the questions. One question for Jacqui is they wanted to know, how did your intersectionality experience play out?
So in my experience, a lot of times when you are dealing with a Black person or a person of color, sometimes you may think that the only ism they're dealing with in the workplace is racism. And for me specifically, that was not the case. So in addition to dealing with racism in my workplace, I was actually dealing with sexism. I was dealing with narcissism. And, shockingly enough, I was dealing with colorism, and they were all intersecting and happening, at various times throughout my career.
Thank you for that. Great. We had another question. And again, if you want to ask the question directly, you're welcome to unmute yourself. Please talk about responsibility as a citizen and what we can do to keeping individuals that are weak, to put them in those positions. I believe that's for Kevin, because you did talk about that you noticed some of the structural inequities are still there from a hierarchy. Can you talk about that? What can be done? Because we're looking for solutions and
right.
Okay.
So I think it's incumbent upon the leadership. To your point, Denise, I don't think I do think that Diversity Works, one of your biggest strengths is to work with the leadership of those companies that you guys do and try, because that's where it starts. Like the Tesla. I don't know if you've heard about the Tesla lawsuits where they've been getting sued all over the place. Well, that's a function of Elon Musk tolerating what is obvious racism, right? I mean, it's not. I don't care. Clearly, it doesn't matter what kind of program they have. It's not working when they've got they just lost $130 million in a lawsuit. And I think, I don't, more lawsuits need to be filed, but there needs to be more, like people losing their government contracts. Like now that Elon Musk has, his Tesla's been sued and successfully had to settle a lawsuit. They should be barred from getting more government contracts. They got a $2 billion grant early on in their process. So those kinds of, punitive is the wrong word, but let's use punitive actions to try to change people's behavior, I think is something that we need to look at. I think people don't pay a big enough price for their bad actions.
And Denise, this is Holly. If I can add on just for a second there, I think that a lot of the transparency and scrutiny efforts by third parties like Kevin are really driving accountability and change.
Right. You don't want Kevin knocking at your door. So definitely we want to make sure that accountability piece is being looked at. And again, what we do, we also look at the external factors of organization. Diversity Works, when we do a plan for you, we also look at that and let you see what you look like within your peer group. We have one other question that asks, what would an ideal workplace look like if people are treated fairly and promoted and giving opportunities? So I guess reimagining the workplace. Since you both are out there and had experiences, what would that look like to you all?
Jacqui, you go first if you want.
Okay. I think it would look like an environment where everyone is held to the same standard. And let me just give you another quick example from my experience. I worked at a for-profit college where there was a row of visitors parking that was right in front of the building. And this was designated for visitors, meaning no employee should park there. Well, if you're allowing white people to consistently abuse this policy, which no one should abuse it. But if you're letting white people that are employees consistently park there and you're not, there are no consequences for those actions, the Black person who's parking a mile away notices that and then attempts to park there. And now they're given the verbal warnings, they're being threatened for write-ups and this and that. Then you're not really applying that standard across the board. So for me, the first and foremost thing is whatever your policies and your procedures are, they need to be applied across the board so that everyone is held to the same standard.
And Jacqui, well, we've seen that when we go into organizations right now, there is a push to really equalize or make everything a bit more equal than before. Yes. We're looking at it. We have ERG groups now, working groups, different organizations call them different things, but there is an opportunity for the leadership to look at what's happening with all these different groups so that they can make the changes that need to happen so things are not kept the same.
And if I may just add one more thing, the leadership needs to really do their due diligence in making sure they understand the covert aspects of racism, which are more insidious and more nefarious and more prevalent in today's modern day.
Denise, Monique has a question. Monique, if you'd like to come off mute and ask your question.
it's a follow-up to the question of what the ideal workplace would look like. I guess, how are you going to get there? And, I think there's a lot of good policies and laws in place. The issue is that the people that are hired to implement them are not doing it. So what is your strategy for addressing that? And I think also that people of color, Black people, or anyone, there's a need to have greater accountability. You can't have rights without being responsible. And that means that getting involved in unions, getting involved in accountability actions. And minorities discriminate against other minorities. So how do you get to, we're American, we're supposed to be one people. How do we get to the point where we have a common bond in terms of fairness across the board, and achieving that ideal workplace? Because we got a lot of diversity coming on board, but that doesn't mean these people share in the same values that we're fighting for.
Thank you for that, Monique. Would any of the panelists want to take a response to that?
I'll say this. I agree that it's incumbent upon the people, and it's hard to be courageous, as Jacqui said earlier, that when you're working, you need the job, you can't speak up. But if the people on the inside don't speak up, it's not going to happen. I mean, it takes I work with SCLC, so I get to hear a lot of stories about the sacrifices those guys made to be able for us to have this opportunity, right? I mean, it's like, and so I think it does take a lot of courage that, and also a little bit of knowledge, right? I don't think we share, again, everyone feels isolated, and they're not isolated. I mean, all these things are the same everywhere. And I think we do need to get people to come together more. And I do believe that, holding people accountable, being more aggressive in accountability is important. Like I said, if someone's been sued for discrimination, they shouldn't be allowed to apply for government contracts. I mean, I think you have to that's the kind of thing that will make people get more aggressive about who they hire and how they manage who they hire.
Well, and if I may just add one thought to that, I think about the famous words of Vice President Kamala Harris. She said something that really resonated with me as I was writing my book. She said that, in order to understand a person's circumstances, you have to be able to see and feel and smell what they're going through. So organizations that are interested in implementing authentic and effective DEI, they need to put in measures that ensures that their leaders can actually see and smell and feel the circumstances of the marginalized people. That's what my book allows you to do. It actually takes the reader, no matter what color they are, no matter what their background is, and it puts you into the shoes of a racial discrimination victim. So you see it and you feel it as if it's happening to you or to someone close to you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
There's one thing I will, this is a little, psychoanalysis, but one thing we forget, especially for Black Americans, that we're indoctrinated from a very young age through school. My roommate in college was an education major. He was a white guy, and he said, he doesn't know how any Black kids ever learn when all the teachers hate them so much, right? And you don't realize how that transcends. If you think about it, the two highest achieving African Americans in U.S. history, President Obama and Kamala Harris, both lived overseas, right? They didn't grow up in Oakland. They didn't grow up in Kansas. I mean, so so all of those things run through the way we see ourselves and the way other people see us. And that's, it's beyond what you can do with D&I, but it does factor into how, when Jacqui said when the Black person parks in the white place, they get treated more inequitably. Well, that's because people have been trained to treat our kids, why our kids are suspended from school more often than others. I mean, all those things factor into this.
Right. Thank you for that. And that's part of the trauma, I believe, that Jacqui was alluding to. She talked about trauma goes in deep, and it's we even think about and I know in Houston, I attended a session somewhere, and it was built for the Jewish community, where they talk about trauma that had happened during the Holocaust, which is so real and important, and it was really for healing. And maybe that's what's needed to heal, to look at that trauma, to really not forget it. Because one of the things they say, sometimes when you think you're going to forget something that happened, slavery wasn't that far long ago, but we want to forget about it and say it doesn't exist, or it doesn't exist. But thank you for sharing that. Marcia has her hands up. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Marcia. Go ahead, ask your question.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you for this opportunity. So I'm just in a role a year as the Chief Diversity Officer at a healthcare organization. And it's a little more traditional and, the first CDO of the organization. But I wanted to just throw out there something that I've seen and heard on social media in regards to the Super Bowl halftime show. And some of the statements from non-people of color that they are tired of hearing Black Lives Matter. They are tired of seeing, they didn't understand why, I'm including Eminem in the Black votes because, but why was the halftime show of only, Black people? And I'm getting that fatigue from folks that I'm tired of hearing about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. We all understand about, not wanting to teach the history in our schools. So as a diversity officer, I'm getting this, we're tired of hearing about diversity and inclusion. So what I'm trying to do is engage those who speak are tired of hearing about it. But what other things can I do organizationally wide in regards to those who are fatigued in hearing about diversity, equity, and inclusion? Thank you.
So I'll say this: it's not easy. Where you are is not an easy place. I mean, you took on a tough job, especially if it's a company that has issues. And unfortunately, the only thing for you to do is to stand strong and keep fighting going forward. I'll say, Dr. King has a quote. One of my favorite quotes from Dr. King is that the arc of history bends towards justice. But the corollary to that is it bends towards justice because a lot of people lay their bodies on it to push in that direction. So, when Dr. King was assassinated, his approval rating in the country was like 35%. Right? So people are always going to be tired of you asking for your fair share. That's always going to be an issue. So I don't know that. So it's just really you've signed on.
Yeah, it's a tough, and that's one of the reasons that we sort of developed this DI network, Marcia, to have a place or venue for people to discuss things, exactly what you're going through. And it's because of the time element that we're facing, we would love to talk to you more about that. But again, it's really letting people understand the structural inequities that have taken place. It's not that we're tired, because a lot of people have gone through this over and over again, and they don't see an end in sight. And I believe, just an example, I think CNN was talking about this young man that was beaten up with two young people fighting. Again, so why does it matter? All lives matter, but Black lives matter so all lives can matter. And the purpose of our session today is to really show that there is a different experience out there. And sometimes in organizations, sometimes you don't see what you don't see. And that's the part of the unconscious bias or the implicit bias that goes on. It's not, bias is not relegated to one race or color or gender. It's all of us. And we have to realize that we're all in this together if we want to see change.
And if I might just add as well, I keep going back to what Vice President Kamala Harris said, oftentimes you can't change the heart and the mind of someone until they are able to understand the circumstances of the people that you're trying to help. So if I were in your situation, what I would do is I would actually put my book in front of them and I would have them read, maybe 2 or 3 chapters at a time, and then come back for healthy discussion. Because until they can understand what we are going through, they're not going to be sensitive to what you are trying to train them on. Does that make sense?
I hear you. I hear you. And again, it differs for everyone, but that is a good point. You have to have shared experience. You have to understand. But again, it's the courageous conversation, Marcia. I don't know how deep you are, but you can always reach out to us, or we can definitely talk to you about what you can do, some tactics you can implement, some strategies. And again, we have an event in March. We have different events that we are presenting, and I'll let our founder, and if I didn't introduce my partners, is Holly, who's our data guru. She knows it all, and our technical expertise. And Elizabeth Curran is our founder, and Elizabeth wants to say something. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Oh, thanks, Denise, so much. I think we have a few more questions, so I'd love to hear from, make sure everybody on the call gets a chance to share. So I'll come in when we're ready to sign off. And
okay, great.
So should we call on Brady Buckner?
Go ahead,
yes,
Brady.
First, thanks for Diversity Works for having Kevin on. He is my partner at FSIC. And he skipped over a couple things that I think are really, really impactful. One of them is companies can do really complex business deals all over the world, but they can't hire a minority candidate or a diversity candidate. That's just laughable. And then Kevin, I'd like you to comment on this. Being culturally sensitive is not the same as being economically inclusive.
Yeah, totally. Now, I think the Sherwin-Williams example is the one I'm going with these days. I mean, they've got $1 billion worth of business in a city that's well over half Black. They can't find any Black people to do business with. That's laughable. And they may give money to some great charities, but where it matters, they're not being inclusive. So yeah, thanks, Brady, for pointing that out.
And then finally, Ms. Abram, if you could tell us, you who are probably in a lot of situations where you had to find a way to say something to somebody and you knew you were probably going to make them uncomfortable. Did you have any ways of doing that without, getting in somebody's face, or somebody that wanted to come forward and say something, but they didn't know how, and advice you gave them?
So I'll tell you.
And thank you, everyone.
Well, I'll tell you that in my experience, and this is in every single company that I worked in, trying to fight against racial discrimination is a very lonely road. And let me tell you why I say that. One of the first things that happens to you after you are dehumanized is that you are ostracized and no one wants to come near you. And so trying to find people to partner with you or to come forward because there's strength in numbers is very difficult to do when you are the one being targeted. Because, as I mentioned earlier, people have their own livelihoods to consider. And one woman actually told me, and I'll tell you verbatim what she said to me when I said, let's go forward and, we can tell them what's happening to us. She told me point blank, if I have to choose between you paying your mortgage and me paying my mortgage, I'm going to choose me. I'm not putting myself out there. I feel for you. I see what's happening to you, but you're essentially on your own.
Yeah. And then that goes through with the strategy and the policies of the organizations where you were at that seemed there wasn't a safe place to have that discussion. There wasn't a key person to go to and talk and express what was going on, but that happens. We do see that as we do our work. Yes. I think we have a question from Tanner. Do you want to go ahead and get yourself off mic? I saw a question here from someone named Tanner.
He may have left.
Okay.
Tanner, if you're there, we're sorry we missed your Anybody else want to come off mute and ask a question? I see some former colleagues like Maya. Good to see you, Maya. Not to put you on the spot. All right. Well, I think we'll wrap it up then, Elizabeth.
Go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much. If we didn't get to your question, send us an email. We'd love to continue the conversation with you all. As Denise mentioned, we do this every month, the third Thursday at 1 o'clock Eastern time, and we'd love to have you join us next time. My background is in strategic communication, so I actually picked next month's topic, which is about how to get the media to pay attention to your DEI story. And I have a former colleague of mine and his partner are going to present how you can get your ideas and actions and your leaders more high profile in the media, and the different benefits that comes with that. I mean, first of all, it helps raise your profile with potential employees. It demonstrates the commitment to your values, and it really validates the hard work that you're doing on DEI. And we know it's a journey. It's not a sprint. So next month we'll have Chris Eisenla and Brad Luna of Luna Eisenla Media. They are a certified LGBTQ owned small business, and they're going to share their insights and knowledge gleaned from just decades of experience helping their clients generate headlines and bylines and all sorts of media. So if you are interested in that topic, we encourage you to join. Holly will be sending out an email with a reminder for that. And then, thank you so much for everybody to participate today. It was a really awesome session, and thank you so much to our panelists for taking the time to present. Please connect with everybody on LinkedIn so we can stay in touch. And the recording will be available in a few days. We'll post that to our YouTube channel and email out a link in case there's anything that you want to come back and listen to again. So again, thanks all for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you next month.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. And if we didn't answer your questions again, just make sure you email us, and then we'll get back to you. And we want to make sure we stay on topic and on task. If you have any special topic you want us to present, let us know.
Thanks, Denise.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.